Alright, welcome to General Anatomy and Physiology Online. Today we're going to be reviewing the reproductive system. And our agenda today is to review the male reproductive anatomy, the hormones of the male reproductive system, process of spermatogenesis, female reproductive anatomy review, oogenesis, which is similar to spermatogenesis but in the female, and basically sex cell division, also known as meiosis, follicle development of the follicles around the eggs, and the menstrual cycle. So we'll start by looking at just a quick review of the anatomy of the male. We should have had this, or you should be working on this with the lab component as well. But we have the testes. The male have two testes, and the purpose of the testes is twofold. One to produce sperm, and the other to produce testosterone. They are housed in the scrotum, and you will also notice coming off of the testes is this comma-shaped structure here known as the epididymis. And what takes place in the epididymis is sperm production, sperm maturation. So the sperm are produced in the testes, they go on to mature further in the epididymis. Now inside the testes there's yards and yards of this tubular structure known as the seminiferous tubules, and that is where the sperm are being produced, and on the outside of it is where the testosterone is being produced. So once the sperm have matured in the epididymis and the male has an ejaculation, the sperm then travel through this ductus deferens, otherwise better known as the vas, V-A-S, vas deferens, and they flow through up and around the bladder, and they then join right here with our first gland called the seminal vesicle, or the seminal gland. And the seminal gland will release some fluid that mixes with the sperm, and that will travel down in through the prostate gland, and the prostate gland will also release some fluid that mixes with that as well. It will continue to travel down through the urethra, where our last gland, the Cowper's gland or the bulbourethral gland, will also secrete some fluid that mixes with the sperm. So the sperm is the sex cell, the seminal gland or the seminal vesicle, the prostate gland, and the bulbourethral or the Cowper's gland are all going to release some fluid that mixes with the sperm to basically nourish it, protect it, and all of those components together are known as semen. Now, the prostate gland there is at the base of the bladder, and it has the urethra running through it as well. And this urethra portion going through the prostate gland is known as the prostatic urethra. So the male reproductive system, the urethra serves both for reproductive reasons but also for the urinary reasons as well. Once it gets out, once the urethra passes through the prostate gland, there's a small section right here where it is not in the prostate gland and it's before the penis. This is called the membranous urethra. The membranous urethra. It's just in front of the Cowper's gland here, the bulbourethral gland. And then the portion of the urethra that's in the penis is called the penile urethra. The penile urethra. When males are born, they have a foreskin over the head of their penis. This is called the prepuce. And males have two different types of erectile tissue, which you'll learn more about in lab. And the erectile tissue will engorge with blood to give the male an erection. And at the very end of the penis is the glans penis, which is also full of erectile tissue. So this is a basic review of the anatomy of the male reproductive system. You will get a lot more detail in the lab portion of that. Now what about the hormones? What's regulating males and their reproductive system? And the first hormone is GnRH. This stands for gonadotropin releasing hormone. Now that is coming from the hypothalamus of the brain, and it is going to communicate to the next area right here to release two hormones called luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And these two hormones are known as gonadotropins. These two hormones are found in your anterior pituitary gland. So the gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus releases, stimulates the luteinizing hormone or the follicle stimulating hormone, together known as gonadotropins, from the anterior pituitary gland. Now the luteinizing hormone will go to the male testes to initiate testosterone production from the specific cells known as the interstitial cells. Follicle stimulating hormone will go to the testes to help produce sperm production that takes place within the testes, specifically within the seminiferous tubules of the testes. So all of these hormones are relying on one another in order to make more and be released. This is hormone acting on a hormone. We call that hormonal stimulation. So you know, if you want luteinizing hormone, you have to have GnRH. If you want testosterone, you had to have a luteinizing hormone. So these hormones are relying on one another. Testosterone is classified as an androgen hormone, which is a growth hormone. It promotes male reproductive growth, such as the penis and the testes during the puberty years, as well as secondary sex characteristics, such as pubic hair, vocal cord growth, the Adam's apple or the thyroid cartilage, sperm cell production, and aggressive behavior. And so testosterone obviously peaks when a male is going through their puberty years, and promotes all of these, all of the following that you see here. The process of sex cell division is called meiosis. Now we don't get into that in this course here at all. I just want to kind of give you a brief review of it. You will learn about it more in advanced A&P for those that have to move on. But specifically, sex cell division in a male is called spermatogenesis, because we're talking about the division of the sex cells to produce sperm cells. So spermatogenesis is sperm cell production. It takes place within the seminiferous tubules, which again are located within the testes. And what happens is there's these cells within the testes, and specifically the seminiferous tubules, known as germ cells, and they divide to form 4 functional sperm cells. So from one germ cell we can produce 4 functional sperm cells, and that's different from the female, as you will see. Okay. Now 23 the sex cells all have 23 pairs of chromosomes. 22 of them are autosomal pairs, which are your body traits, and then one of them is your sex cell. So males can either have an X or a Y sex cell, if you will, and whereas the female only has an X. So if a Y sex cell fertilizes a female, then you have X and a Y, which is going to be a male. And if an X sex cell of a sperm fertilizes an X sex cell of a female, X and X, you're going to get a female. So males are going to, sperm cells are going to be able to determine you know, what the sex of this child is going to be, whether it's going to be a male or a female, because the male sperm either carry an X or a Y sex chromosome. Okay, and so we have 23 pairs in the sex cells. 22 of them are autosomal or body traits, and then the one is the sex cell, which determines the sex of the child. All right. Next we have the anatomy review of the female. And so there are a lot of similarities here with what we saw earlier with the male. Females have 2 ovaries, as you can see here in this photo, and their job is to do exactly or similar to what males. They're to produce the egg, and they're produced the hormones progesterone and estrogen. And from there, you have the fallopian or the uterine tube here, and this is the path that the egg has to take when it's ovulated. So this is kind of like the vas deferens of the male. The sperm had to go through that vas deferens. Here the egg has to go through a uterine tube. You have these little fimbriae here, which are just little extensions that help swoosh the egg into the uterine tube. You have the infundibulum, which is the opening at the ovary end of the uterine or fallopian tube. As it travels down, we then travel into the uterus. The uterus has three areas to it. We have the top, which is the fundus. We have the middle section, which is the body. And we have the lower section where it narrows, which is called the cervix. The uterus also has three layers. We have the inner layer, which is the endometrium. This is the layer that will shed. It's fairly thin, shed once per month. We have the middle layer, which is the myometrium, which is the muscle portion of the uterus, and the outside layer, which is the perimetrium. And the myometrium is going to be the thickest layer of the three. The vagina is below the cervix and the uterus that you see here. I think that's about it that we want to talk about here with the female anatomy review. Females also follow the same pattern of hormone control, if you will. We have the GnRH, which comes from the hypothalamus, which then signals for the luteinizing hormone or follicle stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary gland, so nothing's different there with male and female. The difference is what it's going to control here. So luteinizing hormone controls progesterone and estrogen release, and follicle stimulating hormone produces follicle development around the eggs. So meiosis also occurs in the female. We call it oogenesis, and this is production of the oocyte, which is the egg, and it comes from an oogonia cell. So one functional ovum or egg is coming from one oogonia cell. So in the male we have the germ cell that made 4 sperm cell, and in the female we have one oogonia cell that produces one functional ovum or egg. Okay, so there is some difference there. So males are producing more sperm than the egg, and you know, males are producing sperm every day, where only one egg is typically only one egg is selected per month, and it rotates between each ovary, okay, to be ovulated. Now this is a very detailed picture here of this process of oogenesis. I don't want to get into detail because again I think it's going beyond the scope of what we need to know here in this class, but I just wanted to kind of point out a couple things here. So here's your ovary. Up at the top is your oogonia cell here. One of them is chosen to move on and split until you get this one functional egg that's ovulated here, and that egg may be fertilized here by a sperm, as you can see taking place. So there's a lot more going on in here that I don't want you to know. If you go on to another like Advanced A&P, they'll talk all about this in much more detail. So around the eggs there's these follicles. These are basically layers of cells that help nourish the egg along so that it can mature. And the 2 follicles we're going to talk about are your primary and your Graafian follicle. So if we look here, this is the ovary, and up here we had one egg that's been chosen right here that I'm pointing at, and around it you have, see, this is oocyte, and around it you have a primary follicle. Now primary, you know, obviously primary means beginning, so these follicles are not very big, but they're going to do the job. They're going to nourish it, hopefully, and move it along. So within 14 days, your ovary has chosen one of these eggs here to mature, has a primary follicle around it, and as it gets to about day 14, this egg becomes a secondary oocyte. It's a mature oocyte, and around it is this mature or Graafian follicle that you see, and it's very blister-like. It's really hard to ignore, and this secondary oocyte will be ovulated out, but this mature Graafian follicle is not ovulated out with it. That goes on to become this structure right here, which is the corpus luteum. Now the corpus luteum was the Graafian follicle prior to ovulation. Okay, so that's very important. So what's important about the corpus luteum? So this is happening after ovulation. This is the follicle after ovulation, and it's very convoluted in appearance, very twisted and has a lot of turns in it, if you will. And its job is to release a lot of progesterone. So what's important about progesterone? Pro means for life. Okay, so this progesterone, this hormone, is really important for the development of the embryo and the fetus. So if the female is not pregnant, the corpus luteum will stick around for 10 to 12 days and then it will degenerate. Because if the female's not pregnant, why do we want it to continue to release progesterone? Remember, progesterone is for the development of the embryo and the fetus. And if no fertilization happened, there's no need for it. So after 10 to 12 days, that kind of degenerates. Now, what if the female is pregnant? Well, then we want this to stick around because it's going to release a lot of progesterone. So if the female is pregnant, it will stick around for up to about 3 months of pregnancy and support the pregnancy for 3 months. So why only 3 months? What happens at the 3-month mark? Well, the placenta is fully developed at that point, and the placenta takes over for the corpus luteum. The placenta starts to make a bunch of progesterone. Okay, so that's why only up to 3 months if the female is pregnant. And again, here's a picture of that corpus luteum. This never leaves the ovary. Okay, it's always there. The only thing that leaves the ovary is this egg to be fertilized. Okay, and I think we saw that right here. You see that egg leaving and it being fertilized, and the mature Graafian follicle here becomes the corpus luteum to either support pregnancy or not. So what about fertilization? Well, this is when the oocyte and the sperm meet together. So you have 23 chromosomes from mom, 23 chromosomes from dad. 23 plus 23 is 46 chromosomes. And that's your very first cell, is called a zygote cell. So if we look here, you can see all the sperm traveling up through the vagina, through the uterus, up the fallopian tube to fertilize that egg way up here. And that's where fertilization typically takes place, is closer to the ovary. And so that first cell that we get is called a zygote cell. And I apologize for flipping through this, but if I go back to this slide here, you can see the fertilization taking place, and there's our very first body cell. Because remember, if they have 23 chromosomes, they're sex cells, but if they have 46, they're considered our somatic cells or our body cells. So this is our very first cell, called a zygote cell. So what's the definition of an embryo and a fetus? An embryo is from time of fertilization up to 8th week of development, and a fetus is from the 9th week, well, 8th or 9th week, depending on how you look at that. I used to say the 8th week of development till fertilization. That's a fetus. Okay, so you hear me throwing that around. What's an embryo? What's a fetus? Now the zygote, that's just the first cell. An embryo is from that first cell all the way to the 8th week is an embryo. Fetus is 8th week to fertilization, or excuse me, 8th week till birth. It's a fetus. Now people always ask me about twins. Fraternal are the more popular. 70% of twins are fraternal. This is where the mother releases 2 eggs and 2 different sperm fertilize it. And so this is where we can get non-identical twins, obviously, from that. They have totally 2 different DNAs. Where identical is 30%, and this is where one oocyte or one egg is released and one sperm unites with it, but then they eventually split, and they start forming 2 different embryos and eventually 2 different fetuses, but their DNA is the same because they came from the same DNA pool, from the same egg and sperm that split, if you will. A little hard to describe on audio here, but hopefully that makes a little sense. And now we're going to go into our last little component here, which is kind of the bigger component of this unit, which is the menstrual cycle. And these are the cyclic changes that occur in sexually mature, non-pregnant females, and it culminates in what we call a menses. Okay, and so you're not going to see the word period on here. We don't use that. But these words, menstrual cycle, menses, menstruation, they all seem like they could mean the same thing when they don't. Okay, so let me give you some definitions. Menses is the shedding of the endometrium. The shedding of the endometrium. Where menstruation is the discharge of that materials. I would say just discharge of the endometrium, okay, out of the body. Okay, so menses is the shedding of the endometrium. Menstruation is the discharge of the endometrium out of the body. And your hormones estrogen and progesterone play a significant role in why these cyclic changes happen, because these hormones are going to go up and down throughout the month, and that's what we need to look at. So this chart is in your book or something very similar to it. I would encourage you to review that chapter. I don't want to give you page numbers just because the book changes, and I don't want to be stuck with a video that has a specific page number on it. But take a look in the reproductive system chapters and you'll find something similar to this. So let's review this. There's a few things going on here, and let's kind of break down each little area for you. First thing I want you to understand here is we have about a 1 to 28 day cycle here. That's what we're looking at. And we always start the cycle with a menses. Remember the discharge or the shedding of the endometrium here. Then we have a phase called the proliferative phase. And we have the secretory phase. And then we end in a menses as long as the female is not pregnant. If the female's pregnant, then, well, we would have a menses, okay? So the first thing you have to understand, we have a 1 to 28 day cycle here. And we have on either end a menses that should take place if the female is not pregnant. And we have two phases in between called proliferative and secretory. So let's look at the proliferative. Before we get to that, you also notice going up we have what's happening in the uterus, we have what's happening in the ovary of the female, and also what's happening in the pituitary gland of the female as well. So those are what I want you to pay attention to. But what I like to do is start with the proliferative phase and go up and talk about what's happening while we're going up. And same with the secretory phase, okay? So proliferative phase, this is from about day 1 to about day 14, okay? Proliferative means growing at a fast rate. So the endometrium after the menses here in the proliferative phase, the endometrium is growing at a very, very rapid rate. As you can see right here, it's going on a gradual incline here. It just lost that liner, if you will, so now it's building that back up. And what we also see here is we start to see a spike in estrogen here. Okay, now remember, estrogen is dictated by luteinizing hormone. Remember, you have to have the luteinizing hormone to go up or down before you can have the estrogen go up and down. And we see that luteinizing hormone spike right here, so the estrogen spikes as well. So right after the menses, the egg has been chosen to go on to mature, and we have this graphene or mature follicle. When we see this, it's ready to be ovulated here, and that's exactly what happens at around day 14 right here. We see ovulation taking place at day 14. What's causing that to happen? Well, it's the spike in luteinizing hormone. If the luteinizing hormone didn't spike, estrogen wouldn't spike, and we wouldn't have ovulation. So we have to say that luteinizing hormone is the culprit here as to why you ovulate. It's this hormone telling these cells that it's time to be ovulated. So day 14, we get a spike in luteinizing hormone, a spike in estrogen, and we get ovulation. What causes that? A spike in luteinizing hormone. Okay. Just also a disclaimer, please do not plan your family plannings around this chart. This is simply textbook. Every female is different on their ovulation times and how long that they go through the cycle and things like that, okay? But we have to go by something here. So the next, after ovulation, day 15 to day 28, we have the secretory phase. Now this endometrium is plump, it's full of blood, it's very thick, and it's ready for implantation. It's ready for this egg to be fertilized and that implant and hopefully start the development process, okay? Now what we see here then is we see progesterone rising here. Now remember, what did we say about this? After ovulation, we get this corpus luteum. And remember, it secreted progesterone. That's why we see it up. It'll secrete it for 10 to 12 days if the female is not pregnant, and it will secrete it for 3 months if it is. Well, in this case, it goes down. So in this example, the egg did not get fertilized. The corpus luteum only stuck around for 10 to 12 days and that declined. If the if that egg were to have been fertilized, the progesterone levels would have stayed elevated throughout. Because the progesterone declines, this causes all these blood vessels in here to kink and lose its blood supply to this tissue, and therefore you get the shedding of the endometrium called a menses. Okay, so let me go over that again. When the progesterone levels decline, these blood vessels in here, they kink, they constrict, and they lose their blood supply to this endometrium, and the endometrium dies off, and so these are all dead cells that shed, and this is called your menses. And this is, on the street they call it the period. Okay. So in the 60s they developed birth control. They developed the pill, which is a synthetic form of progesterone. So you take this pill and it's got progesterone in it, and so it tricks your body that it's pregnant. So you could keep taking progesterone and your progesterone levels would stay up through the whole entire month until you decided, well, this week I'm going to have my period. And you'd take a placebo pill, or you don't take a pill at all, and your progesterone levels decline and you get your menses. And so you can regulate your menstrual cycle with a synthetic form of progesterone. But when your progesterone levels are elevated, okay, if they were elevated, you could not ovulate again. Okay, that's important. You can't ovulate, so you can't fertilize when you're already fertilized. Okay, so study this. This is really important. Again, I want you to start with the proliferative phase and work your way up to each of these areas. Same with secretory, what's happening in each of these areas. Basically chunk it off into two parts. On either end, though, you have the menses. And understand, what happens if progesterone levels fall? What's going to happen if that does happen? What happens if they stay elevated? What would you expect? What does that mean if they stay elevated? Okay, so go back and watch. This is kind of an important section. Obviously, you're going to get quite a few questions on this particular area here, and you need to understand this is like the physiology component of this unit. Now, menarche is the first episode of a menstrual cycle. This typically happens during puberty. During this phase, the vagina, the uterus, the uterine tubes, the external genitalia all begin to enlarge. This is because the female is going through puberty. The progesterone and estrogen levels are very elevated, which is why things are growing. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have menopause, which is the cessation or the stopping of the menstrual cycle. You start to get changes in the ovaries. The follicles are too small around the eggs, so they don't nourish, they don't mature. So females typically don't drop eggs, but I will tell you that in menopause, if they do drop eggs, they drop sometimes 2 at a time, more than they did prior. And so females who are going through menopause and accidentally get pregnant, sometimes they will have twins. And that's just because when they do drop the eggs, sometimes it's 2 eggs. The hormone activity drops. It's harder for them to ovulate. Think about estrogen and progesterone. It's harder to maintain pregnancy because their progesterone levels aren't high enough. So you can see how menopause can start to affect all of these reproductive functions that were at one time normal. Signs of menopause are hot flashes, irritability, fatigue, anxiety, emotional disturbances. These are all related to the hormone imbalance. There is some hormone replacement therapy to kind of cut the edge of these signs and symptoms, but there are risks to it, such as cancer and heart disease. So you don't want to overdo those therapies and for short periods of time. So this concludes the reproductive system for both the male and the female. If you have any questions, feel free to email me.